I didn't send flowers to the wedding. He sent a warning. The morning Alara Whitmore was told she would marry Dante Viscari, she was still wearing her hospital scrubs, blood drying on her sleeve from a 12-hour trauma shift. His man stood in her apartment doorway, calm, enormous, holding a single white envelope. Inside was a photograph. Her younger brother, laughing outside his college library. Beneath the photo, 4 words in clean black ink. He stays safe. Cooperate. Dante Viscari wasn't proposing. He was collecting. And the most terrifying part wasn't the threat. It was how practiced it looked. Like destroying a woman's life before breakfast was simply how the man started his mornings. If that were you standing in that doorway, holding your brother's photograph in your shaking hands, what would you do? Well, if this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the channel and follow every twist until the final scene, because the stories we tell here don't pull punches, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us your city and country. We want to see how far this story travels. The wedding took place on a Thursday, not a Saturday with white roses and a string quartet, not a Sunday with sunlight and champagne. A Thursday, as if Dante Viscari couldn't even dignify the occasion with a weekend, as if it wasn't worth the man's leisure time. Alara stood in front of a mirror in a room she'd never been in before, in a dress she hadn't chosen, with 2 women she'd never met pinning the veil to her hair with the efficient tenderness of people performing a task they'd been paid to perform. The room smelled of gardenias. Alara hated gardenias. She'd hated them since her mother's funeral, when the funeral home had lined every surface with them, and the cloying sweetness had mixed with grief, until she couldn't separate the smell from the feeling. She hadn't told anyone that. There was no one here to tell. Her hands were cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs beneath the fabric and focused on her own breathing the way she did in the emergency room when a patient was coding and the room was loud and everything depended on her staying level. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Her heartbeat was elevated, 115, maybe 120. She cataloged it like a symptom. Acute stress response. Physiologically normal under the circumstances. She was marrying a man who had threatened her brother's life to get her to the altar. Her reflection looked back at her, pale and still. One of the women, older, silver-haired, with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd arranged too many things she wasn't permitted to have opinions about, stepped back and examined the veil. "You look beautiful," she said. The words landed flat and mechanical, like a phrase pulled from a script. "Thank you," Alara said, because she didn't have the energy to be honest, and it wouldn't have helped anyway. The door opened. The man from her apartment, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and a scar running white through his left eyebrow, appeared in the frame. He nodded once. "It's time." Alara turned away from the mirror. She didn't look at her reflection again. She had a strong suspicion that if she did, she would recognize something in her own eyes that she wasn't prepared to deal with yet. Not fear, exactly. Something older and colder than fear. The kind of look a person gets when they've accepted what's happening. The ceremony was held in the main hall of the Viscari estate, a room large enough to swallow most buildings Alara had ever worked in. High ceilings carved from dark wood, candelabras burning along every wall, 40-some people seated in rows, wearing the kind of quiet, expensive clothing that announced money without mentioning it. None of them smiled. They watched her walk the aisle the way witnesses watch a verdict being read. She kept her eyes forward. Dante Viscari was waiting at the far end. She'd seen his photograph, the kind of photographs that appeared in the margins of investigative journalism. Blurred, taken from a distance, the subject caught mid-stride outside some building. Those photographs hadn't prepared her for the actual man. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the particular physical stillness of someone who'd learned a long time ago that movement attracts attention. His face was angular and dark-eyed, handsome in a way that had nothing soft about it. He wore the black suit like it was armor. He watched her approach, and his expression didn't change by a single degree. No warmth, no triumph, nothing she could read. That was somehow worse than contempt. Contempt she could have worked with. Contempt was emotional, and emotional people made mistakes, and mistakes were leverage. What Dante Viscari was wearing on his face was something closer to finality, like he'd already made every decision and was simply watching the last piece fall into place. Alara reached him, stopped, looked up. He was 6'2", maybe 6'3". She was 5'6" in heels. She was accustomed to looking up at people. She worked with large men under pressure regularly, trauma cases who came in panicked and swinging. She'd learned not to let a height differential read as a power differential. She held his gaze and kept her chin level. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his eyes. Not softened, just registered. The officiant began to speak. Alara heard the words from a slight distance, the way you hear a conversation from the next room. She responded when she was supposed to respond. Her voice came out steady. She noticed distantly that his did too. Neither of them was performing emotion. Neither of them pretended this was anything other than what it was. When it was done and they were told to face each other, Dante looked at her for 3 full seconds before he leaned in. His mouth brushed her cheek, just to the side of her lips. A gesture that looked, from the assembled witnesses, like a kiss. Close enough to pass. Not close enough to be real. He smelled like cedar and something sharper underneath it, like metal or rain on stone. His breath was quiet against her ear. "Welcome to the rest of your life, Dr. Whitmore." He straightened. His face was composed again, distant and clean. Alara looked back at him and said nothing. She didn't trust herself yet with words. The dinner that followed was the strangest hour of her life, and she had once spent 45 minutes performing emergency surgery on a man who'd been shot 4 times and was simultaneously trying to argue with her about the music she was playing. She'd seen strange. This was different. 40 people ate at long mahogany tables and spoke to each other in low voices. Alara sat at Dante's right side and was spoken to periodically by men who introduced themselves with names. She immediately understood she was supposed to remember and was equally sure she wouldn't be tested on, because these men were not testing her. They were cataloging her, the way a person inventories a new acquisition. She ate what was put in front of her. She answered questions with the minimal truthfulness required to avoid appearing hostile and the minimal engagement required to avoid appearing eager. She had spent 12 years as an emergency room physician. She knew how to manage a room in crisis. She knew how to give people exactly enough of herself to keep them calm and nothing more. Dante spoke to her directly twice during the entire meal. The first time he leaned toward her and said very quietly, "You're not what I expected." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the glass of water in her hand. "What did you expect?" "Someone more frightened." "I'm frightened," she said. "I've just had a lot of practice not showing it. Emergency medicine. You see things that scare you, and you learn to keep functioning anyway." She finally looked at him. "You should probably know that about me. It might affect your strategy." His jaw tightened slightly. It was the first real expression she'd seen on him. She looked back at her water. The second time he spoke to her was near the end of the evening. He leaned in again. He had a way of doing this that looked, from a distance, intimate, and said, "My men will show you to your rooms." Rooms. Plural. She noted that, filed it. "All right," she said. "You'll have access to the library, the garden, and the East Wing common rooms." He paused. "The gates remain locked. The perimeter is monitored." Another pause. "This isn't negotiable." "I understand." "Good." He turned away. A man appeared at her elbow. Not the scar-faced one from earlier, a different one, younger, with careful eyes, and extended a hand toward the corridor. Alara stood, smoothed her dress, and followed. She did not look back at Dante Viscari, but she heard him, a few seconds later, exhale slowly through his nose. The way a person exhales when they've been holding something in for longer than was comfortable. She cataloged that too. The East Wing bedroom was larger than her entire apartment in the city. Someone had stocked the bathroom with the precise brand of face wash she used at home, which told her she'd been researched comprehensively, which was equal parts practical and deeply violating. There was a wardrobe full of clothes in her size, plain, tasteful, expensive, chosen by someone who understood her measurements, and not a single other thing about her. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without doing anything. Her phone, the old one, was gone. She'd been given a new one before leaving her apartment, a sleek black device with a handful of approved contacts already loaded. Her brother Marcus was on the list. She picked up the phone, opened his contact, and typed, "I'm here. I'm fine. Call me when you're up." 3 minutes later, her phone rang. "It's 2 in the morning," Marcus said. He sounded awake. He'd probably been awake for hours, which meant he knew more about where she was than he was supposed to, which meant someone in Dante Vescari's operation had a loose mouth, or Marcus had been doing something stupid and brave. Are you actually fine? I'm uninjured and housed and not in immediate danger, Ilara said. That's the version of fine I can confirm. Silence on his end. Then, rougher, Ilara. Don't, she said. I need you to not do whatever you're thinking about doing. I need you to go to class, go to your internship, and be completely, aggressively normal for the next few weeks. Can you do that? And what are you going to do? Figure out what I'm dealing with. He's a mob boss, Ilara. This isn't a puzzle you can solve by Marcus. She kept her voice level. I've dealt with patients in psychosis who are armed. I've talked down men twice my size who were bleeding out and terrified and making decisions that would have gotten both of us killed. I am not unequipped for difficult people. She paused. I just need time. Please give me time. Another silence. Longer this time. She could hear him breathing. Call me every day, he finally said. I will. If anything changes, any of it, I'll tell you, I promise. She closed her eyes. Marcus, thank you for being you, even when it's inconvenient. He made a short, wet sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Yeah, okay, get some sleep. She sat in the silence after the call for a long time. Then she stood, changed out of the wedding dress using precisely zero reverence for the fabric, pulled on a plain gray shirt from the wardrobe, and lay down on top of the covers without getting beneath them. Sleep didn't come quickly. She lay in the dark and thought about what she knew. She thought about her father, Gideon Whitmore, federal prosecutor, dead 4 years. A man she'd spent her childhood watching work 18-hour days and her adulthood arguing with about boundaries and never having quite enough time with before time ran out. She thought about what it meant that Dante Vescari had chosen his daughter, not a colleague, not an enemy of his own generation. The daughter. What did you do, Dad, she thought, that made someone hate you this much? She'd asked Gideon Whitmore plenty of things when he was alive. She hadn't asked him that. She wished now, with the particular ache of a wish that had no remedy, that she'd asked him that. She must have slept at some point because she woke to gray morning light and the distant sound of men's voices somewhere on the grounds below. The first week inside the Vescari estate had a texture she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected hostility. She'd expected surveillance, restriction, the daily grind of being watched and constrained. What she hadn't expected was the estate's particular variety of indifference, the way the household staff moved around her with professional courtesy and zero warmth, the way Dante himself was simply absent for most of each day, the way the hours stretched out with a silence that was almost worse than confrontation. She had nothing to do. Ilara Whitmore had not had nothing to do since she was approximately 11 years old. She'd worked her way through school, and then through medical school, and then through residency, and the baseline rhythm of her life for the better part of 2 decades had been exhaustion, motion, purpose. She knew how to function without sleep. She did not know how to function without work. She requested books from the library. She was given access, and she pulled armfuls, medical journals she'd been meaning to catch up on, history, some fiction she wouldn't have chosen for herself but read anyway because words were words. She walked the garden every morning in the cold air. She learned the dimensions of her permitted spaces the way a careful person learns any new environment, systematically, noting what was fixed and what might not be. Dante appeared at breakfast on the 5th day. He sat at the head of the long dining room table, already in a dark suit, already mid-read on his phone, and glanced up only briefly when she entered. A staff member brought coffee. Ilara sat 3 chairs away from him, not at the opposite end, which would have looked deliberate and provocative, but not at his elbow either, and poured her own. He didn't speak for 8 minutes. She counted. You've been going through the library, he finally said. Not a question. I have a lot of time, she said. Most people in your position would spend that time being unhappy in their room. She looked at him. I'm sure they would. I'm not most people, and unhappy in a room is a waste of a room. His eyes dropped back to his phone. You're a trauma surgeon. Emergency medicine physician. The distinction matters, though I understand why people blur it. You've been practicing since you were 29. 28. I finished residency early. She picked up her coffee. You've read my file. Thoroughly. Then you know I'm not going to be easy to break. The silence that followed had a different quality from the previous ones. She couldn't name what it was, exactly. Something that required thought from him. I'm not trying to break you, he said. Aren't you? He looked up. His eyes were very dark and very direct. I'm making a point. To whom? She asked. I'm the only one here. Your point landed on the first day. What's the rest of this for? His jaw shifted slightly. The muscle in his cheek. She was getting better at reading that particular tell. It happened when she said something that required him to recalculate. He didn't answer. She drank her coffee and let the silence do what it wanted. On the 8th day, she found the man in the garden. He was near the wall at the east edge of the grounds, seated in the dirt with his back against the stone, wearing civilian clothes that did nothing to hide that he was one of Dante's. The posture, the particular wariness in how he tracked her approach. He was holding his left side with his right hand. The shirt was dark, but not dark enough to fully conceal what was seeping through it. Alara stopped, assessed, then walked toward him. Don't, he said. You don't want to be seen with... How long ago? She asked. He blinked. What? How long ago did this happen? About 6 hours. You've been sitting here for 6 hours. She was already crouching, already pulling at the hem of the shirt with clinical efficiency. He flinched, but didn't stop her. The wound was a deep laceration, long and ragged, from a knife rather than a bullet. It had been pressed closed and badly field-dressed with what looked like strips of his own undershirt. It was infected at the edges. Not critically yet, but it would be within another few hours in the cold morning air. If you're going to ask me to leave it, he started. I'm not. What's your name? He hesitated. I'm going to fix this, she said. I'm not going to report it or leverage it or do anything with it except clean it, close it, and walk away. That's what I do. What's your name? Nico, he said after a long moment. Nico Ferrante. All right, Nico, I need a proper first aid kit and a place I can work without an audience for 20 minutes. What are my options? He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not quite trust, but the beginning of a willingness to consider it. The groundskeeper's shed, he said. East corner. She stood. Come. Then you walk? Yeah. Then let's go. She spent 35 minutes in the groundskeeper's shed with a first aid kit she'd located on the third shelf. Well-stocked, professionally organized, another signal that violence in this estate was not an unexpected event. And she closed the wound cleanly with butterfly closures and medical tape, cleaned the early infection with what antiseptic was available, and explained clearly what signs would tell him it was getting worse and what to do if that happened. Nico Ferrante sat very still throughout all of this and watched her hands. You're not what I thought, he said, near the end. People keep saying that, Alara said. Nobody tells me what they thought. The boss's previous... He stopped, started again differently. The women who come through here, they either go to pieces or they make it political, find angles, work the staff. I'm a doctor, she said. You were bleeding. That simple? She pressed a final piece of tape down. That's simple. She sat back on her heels. Though I'll tell you the same thing I told him, it might affect your strategy. Nico made a short sound. Rough, aborted, almost a laugh. He doesn't have a strategy for you. I think that's the problem. She looked up. He looked like he regretted saying it immediately. I didn't hear that, Alara said. Right. He tested his side carefully, pressing with 2 fingers. Thank you. Take the antibiotics if you find any. Amoxicillin, if you can get it. Don't let that sit untreated. She stood, gathered the used materials, and left him in the shed. She walked back to the main house slowly, in the cold morning light, turning the phrase over in her mind. He doesn't have a strategy for you. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't an advantage exactly. But it was information. Information was something she could work with. That evening, Dante came to the sitting room she'd claimed as her reading space, a small room off the east corridor with a deep chair and a window facing the garden. He didn't knock. She'd noted he didn't knock. She'd started expecting it. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. Something about his expression was different from the careful blankness he usually wore. Not anger. Something adjacent to confusion, or more precisely, The look of a man who had come to the room with a specific thing to say and was finding the room slightly different from how he'd pictured it. Nico Ferrante, he said. She looked up from her book. He needed medical attention. He's one of my men. He was also bleeding in my garden. She set the book down. He would have developed a serious infection, possibly septic within 36 hours. I treated a wound, that's all. Dante said nothing. If that's a problem, she said, I'd like to understand the logic. Your man was injured. I'm a physician. Would you have preferred I walked past him? He should have gone to the compound doctor. He clearly wasn't going to. That's a conversation for you and him. She picked up the book again. I'm not going to apologize for treating a patient. I'm not capable of that. The silence stretched out. Then Dante said very quietly, I know. She looked up again. His face was back to the careful blankness. But there was something behind it now. Something she hadn't seen in the 5 days since their marriage. Something that looked, at very great distance, like the beginning of conflict. Not with her, with himself. He left without another word. Ilara sat in the chair for a long time after he was gone. She thought about what it meant to treat a wound out of reflex, to not be capable of walking past someone who was bleeding, to have spent so much of her life in service to broken bodies that the habit had become deeper than decision. She thought about what kind of woman that made her in a place like this. She thought about whether it was a weakness or the only leverage she actually had. Then she opened her book to the page she'd left off on, and she read until the room went dark. The book was still open on her lap when Dante appeared in the doorway the following morning. Not the sitting room this time. The garden. She'd carried the book outside at first light because the sitting room had started feeling like a cell, and the cold air at least had the honesty to be uncomfortable in a way she could name. She was seated on the stone bench nearest the eastern wall. Nico's wall. She'd started thinking of it. With her knees pulled up and the pages catching the pale winter sun, and she heard his footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him. She didn't look up. He stopped a few feet away and stood there for a moment in a way that told her he hadn't planned what to say next. You're up early, he said. I'm always up early. Shift habit. My body thinks 5 a.m. is a reasonable hour to be conscious. She turned a page she hadn't actually finished reading. Was there something you needed? I want to talk about what happened yesterday. I treated a wound. I told you everything relevant last night. I want to talk about the part where you didn't ask permission. He said it without heat, which was almost more unnerving than if he'd said it with anger. Flat, considered, like a man noting a deviation in a pattern he monitors carefully. She looked up at him then. I don't ask permission to practice medicine, she said. That's not how medicine works. You don't see a person bleeding and stop to check the organizational chart. She held his gaze. If that's a rule you need me to follow, write it down and slide it under my door. I'll read it and do what I think is right anyway, and at least we'll both know where we stand. Something moved through his expression, quick, almost suppressed. Not anger. Something more conflicted than anger. He sat down on the bench at the other end, not close, but not the distance he usually maintained, which was always exact and deliberate. The distance of a man who had calibrated how close was too close and wasn't interested in revisiting the calculation. Tell me something, he said. She waited. When Nico told you his name, you used it. Of course I used it. He was my patient. Most people in this estate don't use names unless they're required to. They use titles, positions, gestures. He looked out at the garden wall, not at her. You used it immediately. I'm not going to treat someone like a body without a name, she said. I did that once, early in residency. A mass casualty event. We were triaging fast and I stopped using names because there wasn't time. And it felt like efficiency. It wasn't. It made me worse at my job, not better. She paused. People do better when they know you see them as a person. So do I. The garden was quiet. A bird somewhere behind the east wall, which meant there was a tree on the other side of the stone she'd never see. Nico Ferrante has been with me for 9 years, Dante said. He's been injured 4 times in that period. He went to the compound doctor for 3 of them. She understood what he was saying. And not yesterday. Not yesterday. Maybe he didn't think he'd be welcomed, or maybe he was afraid of the reason for the injury coming out. She picked her words carefully. I don't know what happened to him, and I don't need to. But sometimes people go sideways on getting help when they think the asking will cost them something. Dante turned and looked at her directly. The morning light fell at an angle that caught the lines of his face, the sharpness of the jaw, the shadows beneath his eyes that told her he wasn't sleeping enough. She filed that too. He was carrying something heavy, something that wasn't just her. "Why did you tell me it might affect my strategy?" he said. "2 separate times." "Because you came into this with a plan," she said, "and the plan required me to behave a certain way. I wanted you to know early that I wasn't going to." "That's not caution. That's provocation. It's information. I'm a practical person. Provoking you without a reason would be stupid. And I'm not stupid." She closed the book properly, holding her thumb in to mark the page. "You know I'm not stupid. You read the file." "I read a file," he said. "Files don't tell you how a person operates under pressure." "No, that's what the last week has been." His jaw shifted. That tell again. "You think I've been evaluating you. I think we've been evaluating each other. I think you expected me to cry or beg or try to bargain my way out with information about my father. I think the fact that I did none of those things has required some recalculation." She looked at him steadily. "Was I wrong?" He said nothing for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "Then we understand each other." She stood up, tucking the book under her arm, and he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite close a definition around. Something between calculation and something rawer underneath it, something that had less architecture and more weather. She walked back toward the house. "Dr. Whitmore," he said behind her. She stopped, didn't turn. "The gates on the south garden are unlocked between 7 and 9 in the morning. There's a path along the outer wall." A pause. "It's been unlocked for 3 days. You didn't try it." She stood still for a moment. "I know," she said. "I wasn't ready to find out what would happen if I did." She went inside before he could respond. Well, the unlocked gate changed things in a way she hadn't expected, which was to say it changed nothing practical and everything atmospheric. She didn't walk through it. She walked to it on the 3rd morning, stood in front of the old iron, one hand on the crossbar, feeling the cold metal through her palm, and then walked back to the bench and sat there for an hour thinking about what it meant that he'd told her. He wanted her to know he wasn't everything he'd presented himself as. That was interesting. It was also, she reminded herself, exactly the kind of thing a sophisticated operation uses to disarm a person they still want something from. She stayed inside the gate. The shift happened on a Tuesday, 14 days after the wedding, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. She was in the library, the actual library, a long room off the main corridor with shelves floor to ceiling and a fireplace that the staff kept going during the days, when she heard raised voices from the room directly above. The Viscari estate was built to keep sound in its proper place. The walls were thick and the ceilings were high, and normally the building's internal geography was acoustically polite. But the room above the library had a floor grate for heat distribution, and if the voices above it got loud enough, they carried. These voices got loud enough. She couldn't identify the second speaker, a man, older, with a particular cadence that clipped the ends of words in a way she didn't recognize from the voices she'd started cataloging. But Dante's voice she knew now, knew its particular register when it was controlled, and the way it shifted when control was costing him something. Right now it was costing him a great deal. "Told you it wasn't time," the other voice said. "The Ferrano situation needs another 2 weeks before we move. You're acting on instinct, and instinct gets people killed." "I'm acting on what the surveillance shows," Dante said. "We don't have 2 weeks. You have whatever time I tell you that you have. That was the arrangement when my father is dead." Flat. No inflection. The kind of flat that meant the words had been said so many times they'd worn smooth. "The arrangement you're describing was between him and you. I've honored it as a courtesy." As a courtesy? A sound. A chair pushing back, or something set down too hard on a surface. "Boy, I built the foundation you're standing on. I carried this organization through 3 years when you were still learning how men like us operate, and you're going to talk to me about courtesy?" "I'm going to talk to you about Ferrano," Dante said, "and about what Nico found in that warehouse. We can do that now, or we can do it in front of the full table, and I'd suggest we do it now." Silence from above. Then the older voice, quieter and somehow more dangerous for it. "You're making an error. I've made them before." Dante's voice had gone very still. Sit down, Vittorio. Elara went completely motionless. She'd heard the name. She hadn't been given it before. No one had introduced her to anyone named Vittorio in Dante's inner circle, from what she'd assembled in 2 weeks of careful observation, was not freely discussed in her presence. But she'd sensed a structure beyond what she could see, a set of relationships that predated her arrival and operated outside her sightline. Vittorio. She pressed the book flat to her lap and listened. The voices dropped after that, too low for the great to carry. She caught fragments, the timeline, the Marchetti agreement, what she knows, that last one landing in her chest with a dull thud. And then the sounds of 2 men ending a conversation that hadn't been resolved. Footsteps. A door. Silence. She sat in the library for another 20 minutes. Then she got up and went looking for Nico Ferrante. She found him in the equipment room off the garage, not injured this time, just working, cleaning a piece of machinery she didn't recognize with the focused economy of a man who uses physical tasks to think. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he'd been about to say didn't happen. "Who is Vittorio?" she asked. His hand stilled. "Don't," she said. "Tell me you don't know. I heard his name. I heard him talking to Dante upstairs. I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking who he is." Nico looked at her for a long moment. The careful assessment she'd become familiar with, the weighing of what telling her would cost versus what the alternative cost. "Vittorio Vescari," he said, "the boss's uncle, his father's brother. How involved is he?" "He's a founding figure." Nico chose each word deliberately, the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain terrain. When Dante's father died, Vittorio kept the organization together. Dante was 21. He needed time to consolidate. Vittorio provided that time. And now? Nico went back to the machinery. And now Dante has consolidated. That's not an answer to my question. That's the only answer I've got for you. He glanced up. Why are you asking this? Because I heard Vittorio say what she knows. And the only she in this building is me. She kept her voice even. I'd like to understand what he thinks I know, given that I don't know anything. Nico's hand stopped again. Something crossed his face, a quick calculation, or something more uncomfortable than calculation. The look of a man who has just confirmed something he was hoping wasn't confirmed. You should mention that to the boss, he said carefully. I'm mentioning it to you. I know. He set down the cloth. And I'm telling you to mention it to him instead. Not because I can't, because you should hear his answer to that directly. She looked at him. All right, she said. She left him and went to find Dante. Basim. I was in his office, the room she'd identified as his working space based on which door the staff gave a particular kind of deference to, always quiet when they passed it, never entering without a knock and an explicit answer. She knocked. Come in. He was at the desk, one hand holding a phone he'd just lowered, the other pressed flat to a spread of papers. He looked up when she entered, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had been expecting a different interruption. Your uncle thinks I know something, she said. She didn't sit. He said so. I heard it through the grate in the library floor. I'm telling you because Nico said I should tell you directly, and because I don't know what I'm supposed to know, and that makes me nervous. Dante stared at her. Not the controlled blankness. Something different, sharper, more urgent. The look of a man who has just heard two pieces of information collide. How much did you hear, he said. Fragments, the timeline, Marchetti, what she knows. She watched his face. That's the part I'm here about. What does he think I know, Dante? It was the first time she'd used his name. She watched that land. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders altered. A degree, barely. And she understood she'd just crossed something. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. Elara. He said it like a correction, or like a door being opened that he hadn't been sure he was ready to open. Sit down, please. She sat. He came around the desk slowly and sat in the chair across from her. Not the power position, behind the desk. Across from her. She noted that too, the way she'd been noting everything, because the posture of a man told you things his face was trying not to. Your father had files, he said. My father had an office full of files. He was a prosecutor for 30 years. Specific files, encrypted, stored on a personal drive he didn't register with the department. He watched her face. I've been looking for them for 4 years. I believe they contained evidence of what he did to my father. She kept her face still. And what do you believe he did to your father? Betrayed him. Fed information to a rival operation during a police negotiation. My father died in that operation. 6 of his men died. The words came out without emotion, which told her they had been carried for so long that emotion was no longer accessible around them. Just the shape of the grief, hardened into fact. I believed your father was responsible. You believed, she said carefully. Past tense. He looked at her steadily. There's a competing theory, he said. I've had it for about 3 weeks. I haven't been able to verify it. What's the competing theory? That the files don't show what your father did. They show what was done to him. A pause. And who did it? The room was very quiet. Someone inside your organization, she said. Not a question. The logic had been assembling itself since the conversation above the library, since the sound of Vittorio's voice saying what she knows, since Nico's face when she'd repeated it back to him. Dante said nothing. Your uncle thinks I have those files, she said. It's possible your father may have sent something to you before he died, a way to protect the information. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Did he? Did you receive anything from him in the last year of his life? A drive, a package, anything that didn't make sense to you at the time? Alara's mind moved back 4 years, moving through memory with clinical discipline. Her father in his last year, the long silences on phone calls, the comment he'd made at her birthday dinner about keeping records, the box of his personal items that had arrived after his death, which she'd sorted through grief-numb and automatic, and which had contained his watch and a collection of old case notebooks, and a small external drive she'd assumed was personal, and had placed in the bottom of her closet without examining, because the grief that month had made systematic thinking impossible. The drive she had never opened, the drive that was currently, as far as she knew, in the bottom of a storage box in her apartment, an apartment she had not been back to in 2 weeks, an apartment that anyone with the right resources could access. I have to make a call, she said. She stood up. Elara, I have to make a call right now. She looked at him. I think I might know where your files are, but if I'm right, we have a window, and it's not a wide one. He stared at her. For the first time since she'd known him, the careful composure cracked entirely, not into emotion, but into something more naked than emotion. Urgency, rawness, the look of a man who has been holding a single thread for 4 years and has just been told it might be in reach. He stood and went to the door, opened it, and said something in sharp Italian to whoever was in the corridor. Then he turned back. What do you need? You need, he said. My brother's number. The real one, not the line you gave me. She met his eyes. And I need you to tell me the truth. Whatever those files show. Are you prepared to deal with it? Even if it isn't what you expected. Even if it requires you to look at someone you trust differently? He didn't look away from her. His answer came without hesitation, which told her it had been sitting ready for some time, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Yes, he said. All right. She pressed her palms flat to her thighs, steadying, the cold hands reflex. Emergency room baseline. Then let's figure out what my father was trying to protect. Marcus picked up on the second ring. I need you to go to my apartment, she said, before he could speak. I need you to go right now, tonight, and I need you to find a storage box in the back of my bedroom closet. It's the one labeled Winter Things, don't ask. And inside there's a small black external drive, about the size of a deck of cards. Do not plug it into anything. Do not open it. Just take it and put it in your bag and go somewhere public. Silence. Then, Elara, what? I don't have time to explain. Can you do this? It's 11 at night. I know, Marcus. Can you do this? She heard him breathe. She heard the specific sound of her brother making a decision in the dark. Yeah, he said. I'm going. Don't go alone if you can help it. Take someone with you, a friend, your roommate, anyone. Don't tell them why. Just don't be alone. She paused. If anyone is in that apartment who shouldn't be, you leave immediately. Don't engage. Don't explain. Just go. Elara. His voice had changed, the careful normal gone, something younger and more frightened underneath it. You're scaring me. Good, she said. Hold on to that. It'll keep you moving. She gripped the phone. I love you. Go now. She ended the call. When she turned around, Dante was watching her from across the room. Two of his men had materialized in the doorway behind him. She hadn't heard them arrive. They were watching her with the particular attention of people who'd just been ordered to pay attention. "My apartment is in the city," she said. "Someone may be watching it already. Depending on how long your uncle has been working on the theory that I have those files, he's had 2 weeks of opportunity." She looked at Dante directly. "Your people are faster than whoever he sends, but only if they go now." Dante turned and said 3 words to the men in the doorway. They were gone before she could blink. He turned back to her. In the late-night light of the office, with the composure stripped away and the urgency showing plainly, he looked different from every version of himself she'd catalogued in 2 weeks. Younger, somehow. Or older. She couldn't tell. "If the drive is what I think it is," she said, "your father didn't die because of a betrayal from outside." She said it carefully, precisely, because she needed him to hear the words before the implication hit. He died because of one from inside. And whoever did it has spent 20 years making sure you kept looking in the wrong direction. Dante stood completely still. She watched the information move through him, not on his face, which had gone very controlled again, but in the stillness itself, the way a person goes still when the ground they thought they were standing on has been replaced with something they don't have a name for. "Vittorio kept the organization together after your father died," she said quietly. "You said it yourself." "I know what I said. He had the most to gain from the organization continuing without your father." "I know." His voice had gone very low. "And he's been managing you." "I know." He turned away from her and stood facing the window. His hands were at his sides, very deliberate, the knuckles just barely not white. "I've known for 3 weeks that the evidence I had against your father was wrong. I've known that someone inside my own organization manipulated it." A pause. "I didn't know yet who. I didn't have proof." "The files might be proof." "The files might be proof." He turned back. His face was controlled again, but the control was visibly costing him, a structure under strain. "I married you," he said, "because I believed your father destroyed mine. I built this—" He stopped, his jaw set. "I built this life around that belief." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "And if I was wrong—" "You were wrong." She said it without cruelty and without comfort, just the shape of the fact. "But who told you to be wrong matters more than the fact that you were. Someone chose this for you. Someone handed you a reason to hate in one direction so you wouldn't look in another." She paused. "That's not your failure. That's a weapon someone used against you." He stared at her. The silence went on long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. Then his phone rang. He picked it up. Listened. His face went through 3 separate expressions in 4 seconds. She caught all of them, the compression of hope, and then something harder, and then something frightened for the first time since she'd known him. "Say that again," he said into the phone. A pause. "How many?" Another pause, shorter. He lowered the phone, looked at her. "Your apartment was already being watched," he said. "My men found 2 of Vittorio's people in the building. Your brother got there first. He has the drive." He paused, "But they followed him out." The cold came back to her hands. She pressed them flat. "Marcus," she said, "my people are 20 minutes behind. He doesn't know he's being followed." Dante was already moving, already pulling on his jacket from the back of the chair, already reaching for something in the desk drawer. "We have a window. You said it yourself." He looked at her across the desk with an expression she would think about later, in the quiet hours. The expression of a man who has spent months engineering someone's suffering and is standing in the exact moment where the cost of that engineering has become real and specific and pointed directly at someone who did nothing to deserve it. "I'm coming with you," she said. "That's not— He's my brother." She held his gaze. "And those are my father's files. I'm coming with you." A beat. One single beat of silence. "Then move," Dante said. They went out into the night together, through the corridors, past the watching staff, out the side door, and into the cold where 2 black cars were already running. And she thought, climbing in, that this was the exact moment the shape of the thing between them changed permanently. That there was no version of tonight that put them back in the positions they'd held 2 weeks ago. That whatever came next was going to be built on entirely different ground than what either of them had planned. She thought, My father spent his last years protecting a man who spent the next 4 years hating him for it. She thought, and someone in that man's own family made sure of it. The car moved out through the gates into the dark city, and Alara kept her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing level and did not look at Dante again because if she did, she was going to feel something she wasn't prepared to name yet, and she needed every available resource tonight for Marcus. Everything else was going to have to wait. The city at midnight had a particular kind of silence that wasn't silence at all. It was the sound of everything still moving underneath the surface, engines and footsteps, and the low electrical hum of a place that never fully stopped. Alara watched it through the tinted window and kept her hands flat on her thighs and counted her own breaths the way she did in the trauma bay. When the situation was bad and getting worse, and the only useful thing left to do was stay inside her own nervous system instead of ahead of it. Dante was on the phone. He'd been on the phone since they cleared the estate gates. Short calls, clipped exchanges in Italian, the cadence of a man issuing instructions he'd already thought through and was now executing in sequence. She didn't understand most of the words, but she understood the rhythm. It was the same rhythm she used when she was running a code. Controlled urgency, no wasted syllables, every sentence carrying exactly the information required, and nothing more. She thought, he's good at this. She thought, of course he is. He's been doing it since he was 21. Then she stopped thinking about Dante and thought about Marcus instead, which was considerably less useful and considerably more necessary. Marcus was 24. He was doing a finance internship and taking 2 graduate courses simultaneously and eating terrible food and sleeping 6 hours a night, and he was the kind of person who said yes to things before he'd finished calculating whether he could do them because he had a fundamental faith that he would figure it out, which was either his best quality or his most dangerous one depending on the day. Alara had spent most of his childhood trying to moderate this tendency. She had not been entirely successful. Right now, Marcus was somewhere in this city with a hard drive full of information that at least 2 factions of organized crime wanted badly enough to surveil her apartment for 2 weeks. And he didn't know he was being followed, and he was probably walking fast with his bag over one shoulder, thinking about how to ask her what the hell was going on. Her phone, the new one, lit up. Unknown number. She picked up. "It's me," Marcus said. "I'm using someone else's phone. Mine's in my bag and I didn't want to—" His voice dropped. "There's a car that's been behind me since I left the building." "I know. Keep moving. Don't run. Where are you?" "Corner of 5th and Aldrich, near the university." She turned to Dante. "5th and Aldrich." He said something into his own phone and then said to her, 11 minutes. 11 minutes, she told Marcus. Go into the nearest open building. A bar, a diner, somewhere with people. Sit as far from the door as possible. Stay on this line. Alara, don't ask me anything yet. Just move. She heard him breathing, heard his footsteps change from pavement to tile, the hollow acoustic shift of an interior space, voices in the background, the clatter of dishes. A diner, then. Good. Bright lights and witnesses and a counter he could sit at with his back to the wall. Okay, he said. I'm in. Order something. Look like you're waiting for someone. She pressed the phone against her ear. You're doing fine. I'm extremely not fine. I know. You're doing it anyway. That's what fine looks like in the real version. She kept her voice level. Tell me you have the drive. I have it. In her pocket. A pause. It was in the box exactly where you said. There was a note with it, taped to it. Her stomach moved. What did the note say? The sound of paper. His voice reading slowly. For Alara, when she's ready, she'll know what to ask. Dad. The car interior went very quiet. Or maybe the noise was still happening and she'd simply stopped hearing it. She had 4 years and 2 months of not hearing her father's voice, and the note was 6 words long and not his voice at all. Just his handwriting described through Marcus reading it in a diner at midnight while a car full of men who wanted that drive circled the block. And it hit her anyway like a physical thing. In the throat first, then the chest, then the particular place behind the sternum where grief lives in doctors who've learned to keep it contained during working hours. She pressed the feeling flat. Don't touch the drive, she said. Don't open it, don't plug it in, don't let anyone take it. Help is coming. Who's coming? People I'm with. Silence on his end that told her he was doing arithmetic. Alara, he said carefully, are you with Viscari's people? Yes. Another silence. Longer. Are they the good guys or the bad guys? I'll explain everything when I see you, she said. Right now, they're the guys who are 11. She checked Dante's expression. 8 minutes away. Hold on. The diner was called Harmon's. 24-hour, fluorescent lit, the kind of place that served breakfast at midnight without blinking. Elara saw it through the window as their car turned onto Aldrich, and she saw Marcus through the glass, sitting at the counter, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, head up, watching the door with the specific alert stillness of a man trying very hard not to look like he was watching the door. She saw the second car 2 seconds later. Black, idling at the far end of the block. No plates visible from this angle. One man in the driver's seat, another standing half inside a doorway across the street, hands in his jacket pockets, apparently interested in his phone. 2, she said. I see them, Dante said. His driver slowed without being told. The second car in their convoy, she'd only seen it pull in behind them as they left the estate, continued past and turned onto a side street. Positioning. She understood without being told that this had been choreographed in the 11 minutes of phone calls. Stay in the vehicle, Dante said to her. I'm getting my brother. My men will... He doesn't know your men. She put her hand on the door. He knows my face. I'm going in. She didn't wait for his answer. She got out. The cold hit her immediately. The specific cold of a city at midnight, damp and sharp, smelling of exhaust and the previous day's rain. She walked toward the diner at a pace that was brisk but not running, hands visible, chin up. She could feel the attention of the man in the doorway across the street tracking her. She didn't look at him. The diner door pushed open with the familiar resistance of a hydraulic hinge. Bell above it. The warmth inside was immediate. Grease and coffee, and the particular radiator warmth of old buildings. Marcus saw her before the door finished closing. He was up from the stool before she reached the counter, and she had 1 second to register how young he looked, how young he'd somehow stayed while she wasn't paying attention, before he had his arms around her in the particular hug that was not graceful and not controlled and not something either of them could have planned. She let herself hold him for 3 seconds, exactly 3. Then she stepped back. Drive, she said. He reached into his inner pocket. She put her hand over his. Not here. Outside. Let's move. That car is still... I know. Walk with me. Don't look at it. They went out together. She moved him toward their car, and she felt the moment the man across the street shifted, weight forward, a step toward the curb. And then something happened very fast in the way things only happen fast when they've been planned. The second convoy vehicle appeared from the side street. 2 of Dante's men were out of both cars simultaneously, and the 2 watchers on the street were handled with the kind of quiet, decisive efficiency that leaves no room for a scene. 30 seconds. Then they were in the car. Marcus was pressed against the opposite door, watching the 2 men being efficiently relocated, and his face had gone through several expressions and settled on something past surprise and into a kind of flat, processing blankness. Okay, he said. Okay. I'm recalibrating. I know, later. She held out her hand. He reached into his jacket and placed the drive in her palm. It was exactly as she'd remembered it. Black, compact, the casing slightly scratched on one corner from having spent 4 years at the bottom of a storage box. It weighed almost nothing. For something that had apparently been worth surveilling an apartment over for 2 weeks, it felt remarkably ordinary. She closed her fingers around it. Dante was watching her from the other seat with an expression she couldn't read in the dark. She held out the drive. He looked at it, then at her. Then he took it. The estate was 40 minutes out. Marcus spent the first 20 in the kind of silence that meant he was thinking at high speed, which for Marcus always resolved eventually into questions. Elara waited him out. He's Viscari, Marcus said, quietly, for the car. Not quite a question. Yes. You married him. I did. Marcus looked at Dante across the car with the particular expression of a younger sibling calculating whether he's allowed to have an opinion in this room. Dante looked back at him without hostility or performance, just the level attention of a man who understands he's being assessed and isn't interested in managing it. Our father, Marcus said finally, to Elara. He's the reason. I'll explain properly when we're somewhere stationary. Is he going to hurt you? Marcus, Yes or no, Ilara? She looked at him. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, and right now he had the particular expression she remembered from when he was 9 and had decided to learn everything about a thing before he would stop asking about it. No, she said. Marcus held Dante's gaze for another moment. Then he turned back to the window and said nothing more. Dante, she noticed, also said nothing. Not a justification, not a reassurance. He'd simply allowed the question to be asked and the answer to stand on its own, which told her something about him she filed away without yet knowing what to do with. The drive opened at 2:47 in the morning. Dante had 2 men he apparently trusted with technology, one younger, with the quiet precision of someone formally trained, and one older who wore reading glasses and moved files with the particular economy of a man who had been doing this for a long time. Marcus, who turned out to have encryption knowledge from his finance work, sat across from them and answered questions when asked with the focused professionalism of someone who had decided to be useful rather than frightened. Ilara sat near the window. She watched Dante. He stood behind his men, arms crossed, watching the screen as the files decrypted in sequence. She watched his face move through the information, not the expressions themselves, which he kept controlled, but the speed of his reading, the way his weight shifted, the single moment when his jaw went tight and his eyes stopped moving and he held completely still for 3 seconds before he continued. She knew that look. She'd seen it on families in waiting rooms. The moment information becomes irrevocable. Stop, he said very quietly. The typing stopped. He leaned forward and looked at something on the screen for a long time. Then he straightened, turned, looked at her. Come here, he said. She crossed the room and looked at the screen. The file was a communication log. Encrypted messages, dates going back 16 years, between a private server and a recipient identified only by a routing code. The encryption had been stripped. The messages were plain text. They were also unambiguous. She read the first page in 30 seconds. Then she read it again because the first time she'd read it, the way she read things under pressure, fast and for structure. And the second time she read it for meaning, and the meaning was considerably worse. The messages were her father's, Gideon Whitmore, writing to someone he didn't name but referenced consistently as V. Planning, documenting. The messages covered a 4-year period, and they told a story she had not been expecting and which assembled itself in her head with the particular horrible clarity of a diagnosis she'd been missing for months suddenly obvious. Her father had not been feeding information to a rival organization during the Vescari operation. He had been feeding information to the Vescari organization, specifically to someone inside it, in an attempt to protect Dante's father from what he'd discovered was an internal threat. The messages made clear that Gideon had developed a source inside the criminal network who'd brought him evidence of a planned coup, that he'd been trying to warn the senior Vescari through the only channel that didn't go through official law enforcement because the official channels were compromised, that he had been terrified the warning wouldn't reach in time. It hadn't. The last message was dated 2 days before the operation in which Dante's father died. V. He won't listen through formal channels. I'm going to try direct contact through the operation. If this goes wrong, everything I have goes into the record. Someone will find it. V had not responded, because V had been playing both sides, because V was the threat Gideon had been trying to warn against. Ilara straightened up slowly. The room had gone very quiet behind her. She could feel the quality of the silence, the men at the terminals, Marcus at the side table, and Dante beside her, all of them holding the particular stillness of people who have just had the floor change shape under them. She turned to look at Dante. His face was, she didn't have the right word. Not blank. Beyond blank. Controlled composure had not cracked but had gone somewhere deeper, gone to a place underneath expression where the actual damage was occurring and the surface above it was simply continuing out of habit. He was trying to save your father, she said. Dante's jaw moved. He didn't speak. My father spent his last 2 years trying to warn yours. The man who killed your father used my father's name to cover it. She kept her voice steady because one of them needed to be. And then used the grief he manufactured to keep you pointed at the wrong target for 20 years. Ilara. His voice was very low. Oh. Vittorio has been managing you since you were 21 years old. Managing you so you wouldn't look at him. That's what this is. She gestured at the screen. That's the whole thing. Dante turned away from her. He walked to the far wall and stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and she could see, from across the room, the specific physical effort of a man keeping himself contained, shoulders set, spine locked, breathing with deliberate control. She recognized it. She'd seen it on herself in mirrors on bad nights. She looked at the screen again. The routing code on V's replies. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the older man with the reading glasses. "Can you trace that routing code?" He glanced at Dante's back at her. "Do it," Dante said. He hadn't turned around. The man's fingers moved. It took 4 minutes. The room was completely silent for all 4 of them, the only sounds the keys and the low electrical hum of the equipment. "It routes through 3 shells," the man said. "Final destination is—" He stopped. "Say it," Dante said. "A private server registered to a holding company." A pause that told her the pause was not about the information, but about how to deliver it. "The holding company is registered to Vittorio Vescari's eldest son." Dante turned around. His face had done something she hadn't seen before and couldn't fully name. The composure was back, but it had a different quality now, like a scar where the skin is healed, but the texture underneath has changed permanently. "Where is Vittorio tonight?" he said. Not a question, a test of what his own men would tell him. Nico, who had appeared at some point during the last hour without Alara noticing, spoke from near the door. "He's at the private residence on Callaway. He's been there since 9. "And Marchetti?" A pause. "Also there," Nico said. "He arrived at 10:30. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the heating. Dante was silent for a moment. She watched him process. He was very good at processing, quick, systematic, the way she did differential diagnoses, moving through implications fast and without sentimentality. "He knows we got the drive," Dante said. "His men outside the apartment. They'll have reported back." He looked at Nico. "He knows what's on it." "Probably," Nico said. Carefully. "Then tonight is—" Dante stopped. Something moved through his expression. "He's not going to wait." The room was very still. "He's going to move first," Dante said. She understood what that meant 17 minutes later when the call came. Nico had stepped out and returned with a face that had gone carefully neutral in the specific way of someone carrying information they did not want to be the one carrying. "There's a problem," he said to Dante. "Tell me." "The Ferrano situation, the contact we had inside Belletti. He's not responding." "Since when?" "Since an hour ago. His last check-in was at midnight. He said Marchetti had moved up the timeline on something, but he didn't have details yet." Nico paused. "His next check-in was supposed to be at 1 a.m. And it's now 2:58. Dante's expression shifted in the way glaciers shift, barely perceptibly, and then all at once. "Belletti's dead," he said. It wasn't a guess. Nico didn't answer, which was its own answer. Dante turned to the men at the terminals. "Pull the surveillance on the compound, the outer perimeter, all of it. I want to see who's moved in the last 3 hours." The screens changed, 12 feeds, angles from around the estate and its surroundings. Ilara watched over their shoulders without being told to, because the information was relevant to her survival, and she was not capable of not looking. The feeds showed nothing unusual. The estate grounds were as she recognized them, the same gates, the same staffed positions, the same geometry of a large fortified property at night. Then the man at the terminal zoomed into one feed. The road approaching from the north, a quarter-mile out. Dark shapes. Parked. Multiple vehicles. "When did those arrive?" Dante said. "First one appeared at 2:14, the man said. "How many?" "I count 6 vehicles. Could be 8, depending on the angle." Laura did the math fast, and the math was not good. 6 to 8 vehicles, each carrying a professional number of armed men, positioned on the approach road at 2 a.m. This was not a negotiation. She turned to look at Dante. He was already looking at her. "The safe room," he said. "I'm not going to a safe room." "Ilara, I'm a trauma physician. If there's going to be a firefight on these grounds, the last thing you need is your medical resource locked in a room." She kept her voice level and her eyes direct. "Where do you need me?" He stared at her. "The infirmary," she said. "You have one. I saw the door 2 days ago. East wing, ground floor. Put me there with whatever supplies are in it, and I'll handle whatever comes through." Dante turned to Nico. Infirmary. Nico looked between them. Now, Dante said. Marcus was the problem. She dealt with it directly, in the corridor outside the situation room, with 30 seconds and no softening. You're going into the safe room, she said. Elara, Marcus, listen to me. I need you in that room, because if you're not in that room, I will be thinking about where you are instead of doing what I need to do, and that will get someone killed, and it might be me. She held his eyes. I need you to let me do my job. He looked at her for a long moment with the particular look of a person who has been managed by love enough times to recognize it. You'll tell me when it's over, he said, the moment it's over. He nodded. A man she didn't know appeared at her elbow and gestured, and Marcus followed without another word, only looking back once, and she let herself watch him until he turned the corner because she didn't know what the next few hours held, and she was not willing to let that be the last look she gave him. Then she turned and went to the infirmary. The infirmary was better stocked than she'd expected and worse than she needed. She did a rapid inventory, 2 minutes, moving shelves with both hands, noting what was present and what was absent, and making the quick mental substitutions that field medicine requires when the ideal is unavailable. There were suturing supplies, adequate. There were IV lines and 2 bags of saline, not enough. There were no blood products, which was predictable, and was going to be the limiting factor if anything serious came through the door. She set up the central table, laid out instruments in the order she'd need them, positioned the lights. Nico appeared in the doorway. How many do you have on site? She asked without turning. 18 ready, 2 more who can fight if they have to. And them? Estimate is 30 to 40. Vittorio hired outside for this. She processed that. The arithmetic was not good. He wants this to be over tonight. He wants it to be over before whatever's on that drive reaches anyone who can use it. Nico's voice had the specific flatness of a man being honest about his own odds. He's been planning for this. If the drive surfaces, his whole structure goes. Not just here, the Marchetti Alliance, the outside contracts, everything. She turned. He arranged my marriage, she said. Dante said he didn't know who arranged it initially. Vittorio put that together. Yes. He wanted Dante pointed at my family. He wanted Dante focused on revenge instead of looking at him. For 20 years, Nico said, it worked. She thought about that. About a man dead for 4 years who'd spent his last years trying to get a warning through. About the encrypted drive sitting in a situation room 20 meters down the corridor. About the 20-year gap between an act of protection and the moment it became legible. Does Dante know about all of it? She said. How far back it goes? He knows what was on the drive, Nico said. He's known for the last hour. And? Nico looked at her steadily. He hasn't moved from the situation room. He's been on the phone, coordinating. He hasn't... A pause. He's containing it. He's not allowed to fall apart right now. No. Another pause. Neither are you. She turned back to the table. I'm aware. A sound from outside, distant, directional. The particular sound of a vehicle moving fast on gravel. Then another sound, closer. She recognized it. Get anyone who can be moved here first, she said. Don't wait until it's bad. Move them early. Nico was already gone. She stood in the infirmary, in the light she'd positioned, with her instruments laid out and her hands at her sides, and she listened to the compound outside begin to change its sound, and she thought, my father sent a warning that cost him everything, and nobody received it, and 20 years later the warning is sitting in a situation room, and the man who killed him is coming through the gate. She thought, he said she'll know what to ask. She thought, I know. She tied her hair back with a strip of medical tape from the supply table, the only thing available, and she placed her hands flat on the steel surface and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and got ready, because there was nothing else she was capable of doing, and this was where she was, and the next thing was already arriving whether she was ready or not. The first shot sounded like something breaking, then the second, and after that it was not discrete sounds anymore, but a continuous roar that the walls of the estate absorbed and returned altered, muffled, distorted, omnidirectional. And Elara straightened her spine, picked up the first instrument, and waited for whoever came through her door. The first man through the infirmary door was walking on his own, which told her he was not the worst case yet. He was young, mid-20s, dark jacket, left hand pressed against his upper arm, with the specific compression that meant he knew where the pressure needed to be and had the presence of mind to apply it. Gunshot wound, upper arm, probably through and through based on the blood distribution on both sides of the sleeve. He looked at her and she pointed at the table without speaking, and he sat on it without speaking, and they understood each other. She cut the sleeve away. Through and through, she'd been right. Clean entry, slightly ragged exit, no bone involvement from what she could assess with her fingers. He hissed through his teeth when she pressed along the humerus, but the hiss was pain, not the specific quality of pain that meant fracture. She packed both wounds with gauze, applied pressure, taped it, noted the time and the treatment on a strip of medical tape she'd stuck to the wall, because there was no chart and there was no system, and she was improvising the documentation the way she improvised everything else when the situation outpaced its own resources. "Next," she said. He looked at her. "Can you walk?" "Yeah." "Then go to the corridor and send in whoever's next. Don't leave the building." He went. 30 seconds later, the second man came through the door, and this one was not walking on his own. What? The next 90 minutes were the kind of time that didn't feel like time. It felt like a series of discrete problems, each requiring its full attention, each resolving into the next one before the previous had fully closed. She moved between the table and the supply shelf and the door, and back to the table in a loop that her body found and maintained without her needing to direct it. The deep muscle memory of years in emergency rooms where the sequence of actions became so practiced it operated below conscious thought. She lost count after the seventh man. What she had: suturing supplies, gauze and tape, 2 bags of saline she rationed with the specific discipline of someone who knows exactly when a resource will run out and is already planning for its absence. 1 tourniquet she'd found in the back of a drawer. A bottle of lidocaine, partial, enough for local anesthesia on 3 procedures if she was careful. What she didn't have: blood products, a surgical suite, a second pair of hands, time. What she did with what she didn't have: she improvised. She used techniques she hadn't needed since a rotation in a rural trauma center during residency, the kind of techniques that exist for when the ideal is simply not available and the choice is between imperfect and nothing. She kept her hands steady. She talked to the men when they needed talking to and didn't talk when they didn't, reading each one in the first 30 seconds, the way she'd learned to read patients, what they needed from her to stay functional, which was different for every person and had nothing to do with the severity of the wound. At some point, she thought it was around the 4th man, or maybe the 5th. She registered that the sounds from outside had changed. The initial roar had broken into something less continuous, more directional, bursts from specific locations, gaps between them, the particular rhythm of a fight that has moved from an opening exchange into something more strategic, which meant it wasn't over and it wasn't completely one-sided, which was the best she could hope for, and she held on to it and kept her hands moving. Nico came through the door at some point she couldn't time precisely. He was not wounded, which told her he'd been managing rather than fighting directly. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, and he had blood on his neck that didn't appear to be his. The distribution was wrong for a wound, too lateral, the spray pattern of someone nearby rather than the flow pattern of a personal injury. "How many have you had?" he said. "I've lost count. 9, 10. 2. I sent to the corridor to rest. They can move. 3 are on the floor, stable but not mobile. The rest went back out." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "Where's Dante?" "Main hall. They breached the west entry about 20 minutes ago. We pushed them back, but..." He stopped. "But..." "We're outnumbered. Vittorio brought more than we estimated." Nico's voice had the flat quality of someone delivering a situation report that contains bad information. "We're holding the interior, but we can't hold it indefinitely. He's burning resources knowing we are too." "How long?" "If nothing changes, an hour. Maybe less." She pressed a final suture closed, tied it, cut the thread. The man on the table, older, heavy across the shoulders, a graze along the left side of his jaw that had bled impressively and would scar but was not serious, let out a breath he'd been holding. "Done," she said. "Stay down." She stripped her gloves, pulled on a fresh pair from the rapidly diminishing stack, looked at Nico. "What does Dante need that he doesn't have?" Nico looked at her steadily. "Time. And a reason for Vittorio's outside contractors to stop fighting. The contractors are hired. They'll stop if they're paid to stop, or if the man who paid them can't pay anymore." "Exactly." So the question is Vittorio. The question is always Vittorio. She looked at the wall where she'd been taping her treatment notes. Then she looked at the door. Then she made a decision that was probably not the safest decision available to her and was absolutely the most useful one. "Take me to Dante," she said. The main hall was nothing like it had been 3 weeks ago when she'd first walked through it as a bride absorbing the specific horror of her own situation. The candelabras were down, 2 of them shattered on the floor, the others extinguished in the chaos. The wood paneling along the west wall had taken damage. She didn't look it closely because she was moving fast and her focus was forward. 3 of Dante's men were positioned behind overturned furniture near the main entrance, and the air smelled of smoke and the sharp chemical smell that she associated with weapons discharge from the handful of times she'd worked trauma cases that came in from active shooter situations. Dante was at the far end of the hall, behind a stone pillar, old stone, the structural bones of the building, solid enough to matter, with a phone in one hand and a weapon in the other that he lowered immediately when he saw her. "I told you," he started. "The drive," she said. "Where is it?" "Secured." "Why?" "Can you transmit the files?" "Right now, tonight, to someone outside this building who can receive them and hold them?" She reached him and kept her voice below the threshold of the men near the entrance. "If Vittorio's goal is destroying that evidence, then the evidence being only in this building means he wins if this building falls. Take that off the table." Dante stared at her. "Who do you trust outside this building?" she said. "Right now?" He ran through something in his expression, fast, systematic. "Caruso. He's in the Southern District. He's not affiliated with Vittorio's network." "Then send it to Caruso, right now, and tell Vittorio you've done it. Tell him, call him. Tell him the files have been transmitted outside this building to 3 separate secure locations. Tell him destroying the evidence here accomplishes nothing anymore." She held his eyes. "He hired contractors. Contractors work for payment and outcome. If the outcome is already gone, the contractors have no reason to keep dying." Dante was very still. "He'll call the bluff," he said. "Then don't bluff. Actually send it. Right now, before you call him." She kept her voice level. "This isn't a negotiating tactic. It's the truth that makes the tactic work." A burst of sound from the west corridor. Both of them went still for a half-second, then it faded. One of the men near the entrance exchanged a hand signal with someone in the corridor doorway. Dante looked at her for one more moment. Then he handed the phone to Nico and said something in rapid Italian, and Nico moved immediately toward the situation room. Dante turned back to his own phone. She watched him make the call. She couldn't hear Vittorio's side of it. She could hear Dante, controlled, direct, the same cadence she'd heard on the phone in the car 2 hours ago. The voice of a man who had processed grief and rage into something functional and was using it now as a tool rather than a weapon. "You sent men for the drive," Dante said. "You already know what's on it. You know what Gideon Whitmore was doing, and you know what it means for every agreement you've built on the back of my father's murder." A pause. "The drive is no longer in this building. It's been transmitted. Stop the contractors, Vittorio. There's nothing left here worth the cost." He listened. Whatever Vittorio said made something move through Dante's face. A flash of something old and hot, gone in under a second, replaced by the controlled surface. "You raised me on a lie," Dante said. "That's a conversation for later. Right now I'm telling you the math has changed. Call them off." He listened again, longer this. His jaw set. He lowered the phone. "He's not calling them off," he said. She'd expected this. She'd hoped, but she'd expected. "Then we need another way to reach the contractors directly," she said. "Who's coordinating them on site?" "Marchetti's man, Serrano." He looked toward the corridor. "He's been running their positioning from the north approach." "Can you reach Serrano without going through Vittorio?" "I can if I have something Serrano wants more than the contract fee," she thought. Fast. "The evidence implicates Marchetti too. The files show the Marchetti alliance was built on Vittorio's framing of my father. If that framing collapses, the alliance collapses, and everything Marchetti built on it becomes liability." She paused. "Serrano works for Marchetti. If Marchetti's exposure goes public, Serrano has no future in that organization." Dante looked at her with an expression she'd seen exactly once before, in the situation room when she'd told him about her father's note. the expression of a man recalibrating faster than he's comfortable recalibrating. "I can get Serrano on a line," he said. "Then do it." The next 7 minutes were the longest of her life, and she had spent a night once in a trauma bay working a 12-year-old who'd been hit by a car, so her baseline for long minutes was not low. Dante reached Serrano. The conversation was short, and she understood none of it. Italian, fast, the kind of Italian that had technical vocabulary. She didn't have even the rudimentary framework to parse. But she watched Dante's face, and she watched his hands, and she watched the specific quality of the silence on his end when he was listening. Then he said something that was clearly final, definitive, the kind of sentence that closes a negotiation. He lowered the phone. 30 seconds passed. The sound from outside changed. It didn't stop, not all at once. But it shifted, thinned, the continuous roar breaking into isolated sounds, and then the isolated sounds becoming fewer, and the gaps between them widening until the hall was filled with a silence that was almost as disorienting as the noise had been. One of the men near the entrance exchanged another hand signal with the corridor, then turned and gave Dante a single nod. The contractors were pulling back. Alara let out a breath she'd been holding for longer than she could track. Then the door at the far end of the hall opened. She'd heard Vittorio's voice through a floor grate and on the edge of a phone call. She had not seen him. He was older than she'd imagined, late 60s, heavy-set, with the particular physical authority of a man who had spent decades being the largest presence in any room he entered. Gray at the temples, dark suit, a face that was handsome in the architectural way that ages into something imposing. He walked into the hall with two men flanking him and stopped 20 feet from Dante and looked at the damage around him with an expression of controlled assessment that told her he was not surprised and was not frightened and had come here on his own terms. He looked at Alara once, a single, comprehensive assessment, then back to Dante. "You've been busy tonight," he said. His English was accented and precise. "Sit down, Vittorio," Dante said. "I'll stand." He looked around the hall again. The overturned furniture, the damaged wall, the three armed men who were watching him without expression. "Where's the drive?" "Gone," Dante said. "I told you. You told me a version of the situation designed to stop me from finishing this tonight." Vittorio looked at him directly. "I've known you since you were born. I know when you're buying time." "Then you know I'm not." Dante's voice was very flat. "It's done. There's nothing left here to destroy." Something moved through Vittorio's expression, the first crack in the control. Not fear. Closer to fury, but contained, the fury of a man who has planned for multiple outcomes and is in the process of determining which one has occurred. "Your father," Vittorio said, "was going to dismantle everything I built. You understand that? Everything. 30 years of work, of building something that survives, that has structure and continuity. He wanted to hand it to some federal negotiation process, like it was just—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He was going to destroy this family. "He was the family," Dante said. "He was a liability." The word landed like something physical. Alara saw it reach Dante, saw the single second of what it cost him to hear that word applied to his father, from the mouth of the man who'd raised him in the aftermath, and she saw the moment the cost was acknowledged and then deliberately set aside. "You've spent 20 years telling me Gideon Whitmore killed him," Dante said. "Whitmore was useful. He was asking questions. He had contacts. It was simple to— You used him." Dante's voice had changed. The control was still there, but underneath it, something had gone very cold. "You set him up. You fed information to his investigation to make it look like he was the source of the leak. You let a man spend his last years being watched and suspected, and then you let his children grow up believing their father had blood on his hands." Vittorio looked at Alara again. "She's changed you," he said. "That was the risk. I told you not to. You arranged the marriage," Dante said. "I know that too. You needed me looking at her family instead of at you. You needed me occupied." Vittorio was quiet for a moment. "It was a practical decision," he said finally. The casualness of it, the flat, administrative delivery, practical decision, was somehow worse than anything else he'd said. Alara felt it land in her chest not as shock, but as a cold, clarifying anger that was different from the fear she'd been managing all night. This was simpler than fear. This was the specific anger that comes from seeing something laid bare without apology. 4 years ago, Dante said, when I came to you with the evidence against Whitmore, you'd arranged that evidence. You knew I was wrong. You let me spend 4 years building a marriage on a lie you manufactured. The organization needed direction. You needed, don't. It came out very quiet, more dangerous for it. Don't tell me what I needed. Vittorio looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. The assessment of a man calculating whether there's still a version of this where he walks out intact. The contractors are gone, Dante said. Your men are outnumbered. The evidence has left this building. He moved forward slowly and stopped 10 feet from Vittorio. There's nothing left to negotiate. There's only what happens next. And what happens next? Every family we operate with is going to see those files. By morning. Dante looked at him steadily. Not as a threat. As a record. They'll see what you built and what you built it on. A pause. And they'll see what I do when I find out what's mine was taken. Vittorio stood very still. One of his flanking men moved, a small shift, weight redistributed, and 3 things happened simultaneously. Nico moved from the wall, 2 of Dante's men repositioned, and Vittorio raised one hand, flat, stopping his own man without looking at him. The motion of someone who has been managing rooms for 50 years and does it from muscle memory. You'll expose yourself too, Vittorio said. Everything I built, you've used. You think those families will see the files and not look at what you knew and when? I didn't know, Dante said, and I can prove it. With whose testimony? Hers? He glanced at Alara. A woman you married to punish her father's memory, whose brother you threatened, whose life you... A short, cold exhale that might have been a laugh. You think she's a credible witness for your character? The question hung in the hall. Alara felt both men's attention shift toward her. Vittorio calculating, Dante something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. She stepped forward. My father spent his last years trying to get a warning to a man Vittorio Viscari was planning to kill, she said. Her voice carried in the ruined hall without her needing to raise it. She'd spoken in loud trauma bays for 12 years. She knew how to use a room. He died with people thinking he was a traitor. I have the files that prove what he was actually doing. I have the communications, the dates, the routing codes. She looked at Vittorio. And I have zero reason to protect any version of this story that isn't accurate, including the parts about Dante. Vittorio looked at her. You have everything to gain from simplifying this, he said. Make it simple. The Viscari organization destroyed itself. You were an innocent. Walk away. I could, she said. I won't. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because accurate is accurate. My father didn't betray anyone, and neither did Dante. You did, and the record should say so, specifically. She paused. That's not loyalty to Dante. That's just what true is. Something crossed Vittorio's face. For the first time, something she could identify as emotion. Not fear, still. Something closer to a man encountering a variable he hadn't modeled. He turned back to Dante. What do you want? He said. I already told you. The families see the files. Tonight. And then? And then we have a very long conversation. Dante's voice was absolutely steady. About everything. Vittorio stood in the ruined hall and was quiet for a long time. Alara could hear the building settling around them, the small sounds of a structure that had absorbed impact and was redistributing it. Somewhere outside, a siren, distant. The contractors were gone, and the sirens were still far enough away to be someone else's problem for now, but not for much longer. Vittorio looked at his 2 men, a long look. Then he looked back at Dante. I want your word, he said. Whatever comes next, it goes through proper channels between us. Not... He glanced towards the damaged wall. Not this. Dante was silent for a moment. You don't get my word tonight, he said. You get my decision, which is that you're alive and the contractors went home, and the alternative to that was considerably worse. He held Vittorio's gaze. We'll establish what comes next in the morning, when I've slept and you've had time to understand the position you're in. Vittorio's jaw shifted, the assessment of a man accepting a situation he cannot improve by declining it. All right, he said. He turned and walked toward the far door. His 2 men followed. One of Dante's men moved to accompany them without being asked. Dante's organizational instincts still functioning even now, every exit managed. The door closed. The hall was silent. Alara became aware in the new silence of how much she was feeling physically, the exhaustion that had been running on the underside of the last 2 hours without surfacing, the specific ache in her lower back from hours on her feet in the infirmary, the tremors starting in her hands that she recognized as the adrenaline finally reading the situation as no longer requiring its full services and beginning to stand down. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. Dante turned to look at her. He was still composed, still controlled, but underneath the composure, in the way he was standing, the slight forward lean, the breath that came out a fraction longer than a normal exhale, she could see the weight of the night settling into him, all the things the urgency had kept at bay starting to arrive now that there was space for them. "Marcus," she said. "Nico." Dante turned his head. Nico was already moving. "Get her brother." She nodded. Her throat was doing something she didn't have the resources to manage with any sophistication right now, so she just held it. "The men in the infirmary," she said. "Some of them need monitoring through the night. I'll need to go back." "I know. And 2 of them need hospital transfer. I can't manage what they need with what's here. It needs to happen before morning. I'll arrange it." "And the documentation," she stopped, because Dante had moved forward and was standing close to her now, not in the way he'd calibrated his distance for 3 weeks, the exact and deliberate gap he maintained, but closer than that, close enough that she could see the specific detail of his face in the low light, the exhaustion in it, and the lines the night had carved, and the thing behind his eyes that was not composed and not controlled, and had been there for a while. He raised one hand, slowly, placed it flat against her jaw. Not a grip, not a hold, just the weight of his palm against her face, careful as something irreplaceable. "You stayed," he said. It came out rough, like it had been waiting longer than tonight. She looked at him. "Where would I have gone?" she said. His thumb moved slightly against her cheekbone, a small motion, almost involuntary. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it. I need you to know He stopped, his jaw set. "I need you to know it." She didn't say it was fine because it wasn't fine, and they both knew it, and she wasn't going to insult either of them with that word. She didn't say she forgave him because that was a thing she needed to examine when she had the space to examine it, and right now she did not have that space. She put her hand over his, where it rested against her face, and held it there for 3 seconds. Then Marcus came through the door, moving fast, and she stepped back and turned and crossed the hall, and her brother caught her in the same graceless, unplanned way he'd caught her in the diner, and this time she let herself hold on for longer than 3 seconds, because the night was not quite over, but this particular part of it was, and she needed something real under her hands. Over Marcus's shoulder, she could see Dante watching them. His hand was still raised slightly, like he hadn't quite finished the motion she'd interrupted. Then he lowered it and turned and began the next thing that needed doing, which was how she'd known him from the start, and which told her something she hadn't let herself name yet about what came after tonight, about what kind of man he was when the structures he'd built around himself were stripped down to the bone, and what was underneath was just a person who'd been handed a false map at 21 years old and had been navigating by it ever since. She filed it. She would look at it later, when the infirmary was cleared and the arrangements were made, and Marcus was somewhere safe, and she had the interior space to open the file and see what was in it. Right now she had 3 men in the infirmary who needed checking, 2 who needed transfer, and a building that needed to get through until morning. She stepped back from Marcus, took his face in both hands, looked at him directly to confirm with her own eyes that he was intact. "Come with me," she said, and she went back to work. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Alara worked through what remained of the night with the specific economy of someone who has used up the part of themselves that thinks about anything other than the immediate task. Marcus sat in the corner on an overturned supply crate and handed her things when she asked for them and did not ask questions, which was the most useful thing he could have done, and she was grateful for it in a way she didn't have the words for yet. The 2 men who needed hospital transfer were moved at 4 in the morning. 2 black cars, quiet streets, a private facility 40 minutes from the estate that apparently existed for precisely this kind of arrangement. She gave the accompanying man a handwritten summary of each patient's condition, treatment administered, current status, and what to watch for, written on the back of a supply inventory sheet because there was nothing else available. She pressed it into his hand and told him to give it to whoever received them, and he nodded and left without ceremony. The remaining men in the infirmary she checked one by one, changed dressings, assessed for fever, for the early signs of infection she couldn't fully treat here, for the particular glassiness that meant someone was going into shock they'd been holding off through adrenaline. 2 of them she put on the last of the saline. 1 of them she sat with for 20 minutes, while his breathing steadied because his body had decided the crisis was over and was now processing that decision in a way that required company. At 5:30 a.m., the light outside the single infirmary window went from black to deep gray. Marcus had fallen asleep on the supply crate with his head against the wall, mouth slightly open, looking approximately 16 years old. She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled a folded blanket from the bottom shelf of the supply cabinet and put it over his shoulders without waking him and stood there with her hand resting on his shoulder blade, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing, which was the most normal thing that had happened in the last several hours and which she needed more than she would have predicted. She went and stood in the doorway and looked at the corridor. Nico was there, leaning against the opposite wall with his arms crossed, awake, but with the weight of someone who has been awake too long. He looked at her when she appeared. "The families have the files," he said. "Dante sent them at 3:15. Caruso confirmed receipt. 2 others confirmed by 4. She nodded. "Vittorio is in the east guest rooms," Nico said. "His men are secured. No one's been hurt since the contractors pulled back." A pause. "The formal meeting is set for 10 a.m. The main families, the inner council, everyone who matters." Another pause. "Dante will present the evidence then." "And Vittorio?" "Will be present." Nico looked at her steadily. "Dante insisted. He said it happens in front of everyone or it doesn't have the weight it needs to have." She understood that. The difference between a private reckoning and a public one, the first was personal, the second was structural. Dante wasn't doing this for himself alone. He was doing it for the organization, for the 20 years of misdirected loyalty, for everyone who had operated on a false account of what had happened to his father. The reckoning needed witnesses to become a record. "Get some sleep," Nico said. "I will," she said, with the particular intention of someone who means it and knows it isn't going to happen. She went back inside and sat in the chair next to the supply shelf and looked at the opposite wall and thought about her father. She thought about the note. For Alara, when she's ready. She'll know what to ask. He had known, at some point in those last years, that the drive might not reach the right person through official channels, that it might need to travel a stranger route. He'd known Alara, known her the way a parent knows a child who has become an adult while the parent was watching but still sometimes catches them off guard. He'd known she would find it eventually, and he'd known she would know what to do with it, not because he'd explained, but because he trusted her to reason her way to it. She'd been angry at him for so many things when he was alive. The long hours, the cases that consumed him, the year he'd missed her residency graduation because a trial had run over. The fundamental quality of a man who cared about justice in the abstract, sometimes more visibly than he cared about the specific people in front of him, which was a common failure of people who do large work and which she'd held against him more than was probably fair. She sat in the infirmary chair and released some of that. Not all of it. Some of it was real and would stay real. But the part that had to do with not knowing, with thinking he'd been distant when he'd actually been carrying something too heavy to share without putting it on her shoulders too, that part she let go. She was ready, Dad, she thought, just like you said. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Not crying, just pressure, just the physical need to push back against something. Then she straightened up and went to check on the man with the chest wound one more time before the morning got any further along. What? She slept for 2 hours in a chair in the east corridor. Not planned. She sat down to wait for Marcus to wake up, and her body made a unilateral decision that she didn't have the resources to override. She woke to Dante crouching in front of her. He was in different clothes, dark shirt, no jacket, the first time she'd seen him, without the armor of a full suit since they'd arrived back from the city. His face had the particular texture of someone who also had not slept, the skin slightly thin around the eyes, the jaw carrying the night's growth of stubble. He looked at her when she opened her eyes and didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual for him. "What time is it?" she said. 8:40. She straightened. Her back registered a comprehensive complaint about the chair. The men, Nico checked them at 7, stable. The two at the facility are being monitored. He was still crouching, at her eye level, not standing over her. She noticed that. How are you? The question was direct and without performance, which was the only way she could have received it right now. I'll answer that later, she said, when I have a better read on it. He nodded. Like that was an acceptable answer. The meeting is at 10, he said. I know. You don't need to be there. She looked at him. My father's files are the central evidence. I'm his heir and his executor. I'm the one who can speak to the chain of custody and the context of the drive. She met his eyes. I need to be there. He was quiet for a moment, then he stood. I'll have someone bring you clean clothes, he said. Thank you. He turned to go. She watched him take 3 steps towards the corridor, and then she said, Dante. He stopped, turned back. She looked at him in the gray morning light of the east corridor with 2 hours of chair sleep behind her and 12 hours of an infirmary in front of that, and everything that had happened between the wedding and this moment stacked somewhere in her chest in a pile she hadn't sorted yet. Last night, she said, in the hall, when you... She stopped, started differently. What you said, I heard it. He held her gaze. I know it doesn't fix things, he said. No, but it was real, I could tell. She paused. I need you to know I noticed the difference. Something moved through his expression, quiet, deep, the surface movement of something substantial below. All right, he said. She nodded once. He nodded once. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't absolution. It was two people acknowledging that something real had passed between them, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise, which was more honest than most things she'd encountered in the last month, and which, for now, was enough. He went down the corridor. She went to find Marcus. The meeting room was the formal dining hall, reconfigured, the long mahogany table still centered, but the usual place settings replaced by the deliberate arrangement of power. 8 men on one side, 4 on the other, Dante at the head, and a chair at the right that had been placed, Elara understood, for her. She counted 14 people when she entered, men she recognized from the wedding and men she didn't. The energy in the room was different from the wedding dinner. That had been the performance of normalcy over an undercurrent of observation. This was something more stripped down. These were people who had received files in the middle of the night and had spent the pre-dawn hours reading them and were now here to understand what the files meant and what would be required of them. Vittorio was at the far end of the table. He looked, in the morning light, like a man who had been through the same night as everyone else and had metabolized it differently. Not frightened, not diminished. He sat with the physical authority of someone who had occupied rooms like this for decades, and whose body had not received the news that the situation had changed. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. He looked at Elara when she entered, and his assessment was the same as it had been in the main hall. Complete, fast, revealing nothing. She held his gaze for a moment and then sat down. Dante stood. He didn't begin with preamble. He didn't build to the evidence or frame it or provide context before the content. He put the first file on the table, printed, multiple copies, distributed by Nico moving efficiently around the room, and he said, "This is what happened 20 years ago. Read the first 3 pages." The room read. The silence had a texture. She could feel it, the specific quality of collective comprehension, the way a room changes when information shifts the weight distribution of everything in it. Men who had built years of loyalty on a particular account of history were reading a different account, and the gap between the two versions was not ambiguous and was not narrow. A man across the table, gray-haired, with the careful stillness of someone who speaks rarely and is listened to when he does, looked up first. "The routing code," he said. He wasn't addressing Dante. He was looking at Vittorio. Vittorio said nothing. "The routing code on V's replies in the communications log," the man said. "It routes to a holding company registered to your son." The room's attention moved to Vittorio with the slow, collective weight of a tide. Vittorio looked at the man. Then he looked at Dante. "I did what was necessary," he said, "for the organization, for its continuity. Your father was going to—" "My father," Dante said, "was going to hand leadership to his own son, which is what you were afraid of, because it meant you were finished." He said it without heat. The heat had apparently burned down overnight to something more durable. "You killed him before he could." I managed a transition that kept this organization alive for 20 years. You managed a transition that kept you in it for 20 years. A man at the far left, younger, with a scar on his chin that Alara remembered from the wedding, put his copy of the file down on the table. The Marchetti Agreement, that's in here too. The Marchetti Agreement was a necessary alliance. It's structured on the Whitmore frame, the young man said. The evidence against Whitmore was what gave us the Marchetti relationship. He had exposure to Whitmore's investigation, and we had the supposed proof that Whitmore was dirty. Take away the frame, and the foundation of that agreement is... He stopped, looked at Dante. We have liability in that relationship going back 15 years. The gray-haired man was still looking at Vittorio. Did Marchetti know? Vittorio was quiet. Vittorio. The gray-haired man's voice had not risen and did not need to. Did Marchetti know the evidence against Whitmore was manufactured? Marchetti knew what was useful for him to know. That's a yes, someone said from the right side of the table. The room shifted again. She felt it. The collective recalculation, the speed of men who have operated in high-stakes environments, updating their threat assessments and their organizational loyalties simultaneously. Dante looked at each face around the table, slowly, without rushing. I married Gideon Whitmore's daughter, he said, because I believed his father had killed mine. I was given that belief deliberately. I built 4 years of decisions on it, including a marriage that was coerced and punitive and wrong. He did not look at Alara when he said this. He kept his eyes on the room. I'm telling you this not because I expect it to change your assessment of me, but because the record should be accurate, and I'm done operating on information that was chosen for me by someone with a reason to choose it. The gray-haired man leaned forward slightly. The woman. What's her position in this? Dr. Alara Whitmore, Dante said. Her father's files are the primary evidence on the table. She was the custodian of that evidence without knowing it. She had no knowledge of her father's investigation, no prior relationship with this organization, and no part in any of the events documented in those files. He paused. Her presence in this house has been involuntary. That changes today. Alara looked at him. He was still not looking at her. That changes today, he said again, for the room. She's here now as a witness to what her father documented and what his files establish. After this meeting, she goes or stays by her own choice. That's not a matter for this table. The gray-haired man looked at her. Dr. Whitmore, he said, the drive. Can you speak to its authenticity? She had thought about this moment in the 2 hours she'd spent in the chair, and she spoke now without notes or preparation, the way she gave clinical presentations, clearly, sequentially, with precision about what she knew directly and explicit acknowledgement of what she was inferring. She described the drive. 4 years in a storage box, unexamined, its existence unknown to her until the night before. She described her father's note. She described the chain of custody from her apartment to the estate. She described what the files showed, the communications, the dates, the routing codes, the specific content of her father's messages to the person he'd identified as V. And she described what could be verified externally and what would require forensic analysis and what was already self-evidencing through the routing code documentation. She spoke for 11 minutes. The room listened. When she finished, the gray-haired man looked at Vittorio again. Vittorio sat at the end of the table, and for the first time since she'd seen him, his posture had changed. The authority was still there. It was too deeply physical to leave in a single morning, but something underneath it had shifted, like a building whose foundation has been significantly altered and which has not yet fallen, but whose relationship to the ground is no longer what it was. I have one question, Vittorio said. He looked at Alara. She waited. Your father knew what I was, he said. He had the communications. He had the evidence. He had the connections to bring it forward through channels I couldn't control. A pause. Why didn't he? The room was very quiet. She'd thought about this too. She'd thought about it in the infirmary and in the chair and in the space between tasks where the brain insists on working even when the person attached to it needs it to stop. Because he was trying to save someone first, she said. The evidence was the backup. The first priority was getting the warning through before the operation, before your father. She looked at Dante for the first time. Before anyone died. He was trying to prevent it. The record was insurance if he failed. She paused. He failed. And then he died before the insurance reached anyone who could use it. The room absorbed this. Vittorio looked at her for a long moment. He was a fool, he said. He was a man who tried to do the right thing through the wrong channels, she said. That's not the same as a fool. That's a person who ran out of time. Something shifted in Vittorio's face. Brief, deep, almost invisible. She didn't know what to call it. She filed it without a label and moved on. The meeting lasted 3 hours. She stayed for all of it. She answered questions when asked and was quiet when she wasn't needed, and watched the room reorganize itself around the new information, the way a body reorganizes around an injury, painful, slow, the repair process uncomfortable and visible. The outcome was not clean. She hadn't expected it to be. These were not people for whom clean outcomes were available. They operated in a world where the consequences of decisions reverberated for decades, and where accounting for the past meant accounting for things that couldn't simply be undone. Vittorio's position in the organization was terminated. It was done without ceremony. A statement, seconded by 4 voices around the table, recorded in the meeting log by a man with a notepad who wrote with the careful hand of someone used to documenting things that would matter later. His son's holding company, through which the routing code had been traced, would be subject to a separate accounting. The Marchetti alliance would be renegotiated. The gray-haired man, whose name, she learned at some point, was Farini, and who appeared to be the senior voice among the assembled families, stated this flatly and without emotion. The terms built on the Whitmore frame were void. New terms, if any, would be built on something verifiable. 2 other agreements surfaced in the course of the 3 hours that had subsidiary connections to the manufactured evidence. These were set aside for subsequent review. Each time one emerged, someone at the table noted it, and the notepad man wrote it down. Dante ran. The meeting, the way she'd watched him run everything, systematic, without waste, with the particular authority of someone who has stopped performing authority and is simply exercising it. He did not lose his composure. He was also, she understood, aware at every moment that the room was watching him as much as the evidence, that the question underneath every exchange was not just what had happened, but what kind of man was at the head of the table now and what he intended. He did not answer that question directly. He let the conduct of the meeting answer it, which was the more convincing method. At 1:15 p.m., Farini looked around the table and said, "Is there anything not addressed?" Silence. "Then we're done for today." He stood. Others stood. The room began the process of ending. "Dante." Farini looked at him. "Your father would have been—" He stopped. A brief pause, carefully unsentimental. "He was a man who built things that lasted. We're here." That's his answer. He left. The room emptied slowly. Ilara sat in her chair and watched it empty, and thought about a man she'd never met who had apparently been worth the protection of a federal prosecutor who'd run out of time. And she thought that Farini was probably right, and she was sorry she'd never been in the same room as either of them. The afternoon was quieter than anything that had preceded it. She checked the remaining infirmary patients at 2 p.m., changed dressings, monitored temperatures, updated the tape-on-the-wall documentation with the afternoon's observations. One of the men, the older one with the jaw graze, was running a low-grade fever that she treated with what was available and flagged for the compound doctor who appeared mid-afternoon, apparently having been in another location during the previous night's events, and arriving now to find his infirmary reorganized and his patients documented in an idiosyncratic system involving adhesive tape. He looked at her notes for a moment and then looked at her. "You're the wife," he said. "I'm the emergency medicine physician," she said. "The other thing is more complicated than it sounds." He looked at her notes again. "This is good work." "Thank you." She moved toward the door. "The man in bed 3 needs monitoring through the night. I'll write up a proper transfer summary if you have actual paper." He handed her a notepad without comment. She wrote the summary. Marcus was in the garden when she found him, sitting on the stone bench by the eastern wall where she'd sat on her second morning in the estate with a book she wasn't reading. He looked up when she approached and shifted slightly to make room, which she took as an invitation. They sat for a while without talking. The garden in the afternoon had a quality she hadn't spent enough time in to fully appreciate, the way the winter light came in at an angle that made the stone walls look almost warm, the way the bare trees along the south edge held their shape against the pale sky. The bird she'd heard and never seen was somewhere on the other side of the east wall again. She listened to it for a moment. "Are you all right?" Marcus said. "I'm getting there." "That's not a yes." "No." "But it's not a no either." She looked at the wall. "I'm somewhere in the middle processing things. Give me a few days." He was quiet for a moment. "What happens now, with you?" He paused. "With him?" She'd thought about this too. She'd been thinking about it in the spaces between everything else, which was perhaps not surprising. It was the question that had been present since the beginning, since the man in her apartment doorway with the photograph, since the wedding on a Thursday that had not been what weddings are supposed to be and had turned into something she still didn't have a framework for. "I don't know yet," she said, which is the honest answer. He's the head of a criminal organization." "He is." She paused. "He's also the man who threw himself in front of something meant for me, and who told a room full of people that what he'd done to me was wrong and that it was done, and who said I go or stay by my own choice." She looked at the bird's tree without seeing the bird. "Those things are also true." Marcus was quiet. "I'm not asking you to like it," she said. "I'm not sure I like it. I'm saying it's complicated in ways that don't resolve cleanly, and I'm going to need time to sit with it." "Okay," he said, slowly. "Okay. Then, I read Dad's note again this morning. You left it in the infirmary." She looked at him. He reached into his jacket and held it out. A small piece of paper, folded, slightly worn now from being handled twice in 24 hours. She took it. "For Alara, when she's ready, she'll know what to ask." "Dad." She sat with it in her palm for a moment. "What do you think he meant?" Marcus said. "She'll know what to ask." "I think he meant that I'd know the right question when the time came." She folded the note carefully along its existing crease. "And I think I did. Last night, in that room, I asked the right questions." "That's all he left you. Instructions for a situation he couldn't predict." "He left me more than that," she said. "He left me the evidence, and he left me—" She stopped, searched for the right word. "He left me knowing he tried, that he didn't look away from something hard because it was hard." She folded the note one more time, smaller. "I didn't know that about him when he was alive. I do now." Marcus didn't speak for a while. Then he said very quietly, "He would have liked you right now. How you handled last night." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "He would have had 15 questions and 3 concerns," she said. Marcus made a sound that was, finally, an actual laugh. Short, rough, real. She leaned her shoulder against his briefly and then straightened. "You need to go back," she said. "School, internship, normal life. I need you to go back to it. And you? I'll call you every day. I promised." He looked at her sidelong. "That's not an answer." "I know." She stood. "I'll have an answer soon, just not today." She put the note in her pocket and went back inside. She found Dante in the library. Not at a desk, not on the phone, not in the particular mode of function she'd watched him maintain for the past month. He was standing at the window that faced the south garden, hands in his pockets, the afternoon light falling across one side of his face, looking at nothing in particular with the specific quality of stillness that she'd started to understand was not composure, but its absence. The composure was what he wore. This was what was underneath it. She came in and stood near the bookshelf she'd first pulled from 3 weeks ago. He turned when he heard her. "How are the men?" he said. "Stable. Your compound doctor has it from here." She leaned her shoulder against the shelf. "Vittorio is leaving?" "This evening. He goes to the northern property. It's under his name, has been for years. He'll be there under monitoring. Formal proceedings are a separate conversation for a separate day." He paused. "He's old and he's finished. The families won't restore him. That's the end of what he was." "And Marchetti?" "Farini is making contact today. Marchetti will make a calculation about his own exposure and decide accordingly. He'll distance himself from Vittorio." He looked at her steadily. "The Marchetti alliance was always transactional. It'll remain transactional, on different terms. That's the nature of those relationships." She nodded. "There's something else," Dante said. She waited. "Gideon Whitmore's name." He said it carefully, like someone handling something that required care. "The evidence in those files is sufficient to formally rehabilitate his record. The department he worked for has a process for posthumous review. I'll facilitate whatever's needed. documentation, legal support, whatever it takes. He paused. Best, whatever it might. His name should be right. What it says about him should be accurate. She looked at him. That matters to me, she said. I know it does. His voice was low. It should have been right 20 years ago. I can't fix that. I can fix what it says now. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Then he turned back to the window. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the exhaustion, the line of his shoulders that still carried the weight of everything the day had required. Dante. She pushed off from the bookshelf and walked toward him slowly. What you said this morning, about me going or staying, I meant it. I know you meant it. She stopped a few feet away. I'm not leaving today. He turned to look at her. Something in his face shifted. Careful, not quite hope. The expression of a man who has been wrong enough times that he's learned not to reach for things before they're fully offered. I'm not leaving today, she said again, because there are things here that aren't finished, and because I don't make decisions when I'm running on 2 hours of sleep, and because... She stopped, started again. Because I want to know who you are, when it isn't like this, when it's just ordinary days. She looked at him directly. I don't know that yet, and I'd like to. He was very still. That's not forgiveness, she said. I need you to understand that. What you did, the coercion, the year of planning for something based on a lie, the way it felt to receive that photograph of Marcus. She kept her voice level. I'm not past that. I may not get all the way past it. I don't know. I know, he said. But I'm also... She pressed her hands flat against her thighs, the steadying reflex, and then deliberately let them rest at her sides instead. I'm also not a person who throws away something real because it arrived in a damaged package. And last night was real. The hall, the things you said, what you did in that meeting room, those were real. She met his eyes. So I want to know if there's something real underneath all of this. I want to actually find out. He looked at her for a long time. I'll spend as long as it takes, he said, making the answer clear. Don't spend it, she said. Just live it. I'll watch. Something came into his face then that she hadn't seen before and didn't have a word for yet. Not happiness exactly. Too complicated, too earned, too aware of everything it had cost to get here. More like the expression of a man who has been carrying something for so long that the moment of setting it down feels like an entirely new kind of weight. He raised his hand slowly, and she held still, and he tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with a carefulness that had nothing performed about it. She let him. Then she stepped back lightly and looked at the window behind him, at the garden going golden in the late afternoon light, at the trees holding their bare shapes against the pale winter sky. I'm going to need a real phone, she said. Not the one you gave me. A real one, with my own accounts and my own contacts. Done. And access to medical journals. I have continuing education requirements, and I've fallen behind. I'll set up the library. And Marcus needs to be able to visit. Not monitored visits. Normal ones. Yes. She looked at him. And I'm going back to work. Not immediately. I need to figure out the logistics. But eventually. The ER. She paused. That's not negotiable. That's who I am. He held her gaze for a moment. I know who you are, he said. I knew from the garden. She thought about the first morning she'd gone outside with her book and found a man bleeding by the eastern wall. About treating Nico Ferrante in the groundskeeper's shed with a first aid kit and butterfly closures, and the simple conviction that a person in front of her was bleeding and therefore needed help, and that was the whole equation. All right, she said. She went to the chair nearest the window and sat in it and picked up the book she'd left there, still marked at the page she'd been on before the night that changed everything. The same page she'd been on the evening Dante had come to the doorway and told her the south gate was unlocked. She opened it. He stayed at the window for a while, not talking, just present in the room in the particular way of someone who has stopped calculating and is simply there. Outside, the light continued to change. The garden went from gold to amber to the deep blue-gray of a winter evening coming in. The bird behind the eastern wall sang one last run of notes, and then went quiet. Marcus would be in the car by now, heading back to the city, back to his classes and his internship, and the aggressively normal life she'd told him to live. She would call him tonight, as promised. She would call him every day until calling him every day became simply a habit of the life she was still, slowly, figuring out the shape of. Her father had sent a warning that arrived 20 years late. Late was not the same as never. She turned the page. Dante moved from the window to the chair across from her and sat down, and the library held them both in the low light. And outside the gate that had been unlocked for 3 days before she'd been ready to know it was there, stood open in the evening air and the story of how they got here. All the damage and the distance and the slow, grudging work of seeing each other clearly settled into the past where it belonged, and what remained in the room was quieter than anything that had come before it, and real and entirely unfinished, which was the only way anything worth having ever begins.